Well, hi everyone, it's Chef Hopper with Jeff Cranford again, and we spent a little bit of time talking to you last time about old and new. How the old part of golf is not altogether gone with all of the modern players, that we still see some really critical things happening at Impact. We also talked about transferring that to some understandings about the Christian life, and you brought up some things that were of great significance, because when we watch how people approach the Christian life and then live the Christian life, it's based on a spectrum. At one end of that spectrum, we have maybe what we would call our Messianic friends, our Jewish friends who believe that Jesus is a Messiah, but also believe that they need to be entirely observant in terms of the Torah, the Old Testament law.
A few of them, yeah. That's certainly not all the Messianic movement would do that, but some are Torah observant Messianic Jews.
Sure.
And there's a big debate on that. Right?
Yeah. And then way out at the other end, you would have those who say, everything's off the table, it's grace only, there's no restrictions, there's no obligations, there's nothing. And then, of course, there's the vast middle, which includes, say, well, we hold to the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Those are absolute from the Old Testament, even though we're in the New Testament. And there are some other things that Paul brought up, because, you know, half of Paul's letters are what we should do. Right. So all that's in there, Jeff. What do we do with that? How do we approach life in a way that maybe puts those two things together? One of the things I have always appreciated about this guy, as I've watched you teach through the years and heard the things, is that you are a synthesist. You bring together the Old Testament and the New Testament and see how those things are woven together. And so as we've had this discussion of threads, it fits right in your sweet spot.
Yeah, it has been a vital part of my thinking, is a way I've tried to say, okay, now how do I follow Jesus? How do I practically follow Jesus? And a lot of that is trying to go back and understand, what am I obligated to certain things in the Old Testament? Are we completely liberated from the Old Testament? What was the purpose of the Old Testament? And we've had that conversation at various points in the past. But one of the things, the first thing that I would think about in terms of Jesus bringing these two things together would be the conversation that Jesus had with a guy that approached him in Mark chapter 12. And if you would, just let me read this real quick, and many of you be familiar with this. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus has this encounter, and it goes something like this. And one of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, "What commandment is the foremost of all?" And of course, then Jesus answered, and he quotes Old Testament. So he doesn't say, well, the Old Testament's obliterated. He says this, and he basically talks about the Shema, which is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." And the second is this, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and there's no other commandment greater than these." And I always think verse 32 is very funny, because the scribe says, "Right, teacher." He's in, okay, God, you're right. Like he wouldn't be right.
Yeah.
Obviously, he didn't recognize him as God yet. "And you have truly stated that he is the one, and there is no one else besides him, and to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one neighbor as himself is much more than burnt offerings and sacrifices." So there's a delineation right there between the sacrificial system and then some moral guidelines in the law. So there was a distinction that even the scribe was making. And when Jesus saw that he had answered intelligently, in other words, Jesus was bringing out the fact that this guy recognizes there's a distinction in all these burnt offerings and sacrifice and all things. In other words, God's not interested in that. Even in the Old Testament, God said he's not interested in that. I hate your new moons, your festivals, and all these things, because those were all, that portion of the law was always a picture of Jesus and Messiah. It was a prophetic template for Jesus. But they're hidden within that 613 laws were certain things, for instance, to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus saw that he'd answered intelligently. He said to him, "You know what? You're not that far away from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one would venture to ask him any more questions. Well, Jesus was making a very important conference. I think is the foundational of this discussion. The law, as we know it from the Old Testament, had various purposes, but two of those primary purposes were, number one, to reveal Jesus who would come, and also to underlay what our God is like and what we were created to do, to love him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. We meet guys on the street all the time and they say, "Well, why were you created?" Ask them the question. I have no idea. I don't think I was created. I was just a... No, God created you with purpose, and that purpose was relationship. So part of the law is to say, how does that work effectively? And the other part is, well, now that it's been marred, I'm going to show you through the law of the restitution that I'm going to make myself as I send my own son down the line, and I'm going to begin to unveil this Messiah through the law. So that's an important foundation, I think, to the rest of our discussion, is that, yeah, there is a great link between the two. There's a moral thread that runs consistently, and there's also a thread that led to Messiah, and then that ended. So we're not under the sacrificial system anymore.
A moral thread. I want to take that up with you next time, because sometimes that word, morals, morality, it can be off-putting.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's take that up and see whether we can work with morality, or if maybe there's a better term that we can use.
Perfect. Look forward.
All right.